Let's sit nice and tall. Close the eyes. And just take a moment. Allow yourself to land softly in this moment, at this time, in this space. As you breathe in and out, remind yourself there is so much to be grateful for. Everything, as a matter of fact. And allow your heart to accept that 100% without question in this moment. And just notice that acceptance of gratitude for everything brings such relief to the heart, to the mind, to our whole being. And so give yourself a moment to feel that. Be aware of what you are feeling. Be aware of what you are thinking. As you breathe, become continually aware of yourself on all levels of being: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And notice how you move up the trajectory as you go from physical, and then to energetic, and then to mental, emotional, and then to intellectual, and then to spiritual. It gets difficult, more difficult, to identify the connection for most. And just recognize that that which is difficult to connect with needs work, needs awareness, attention, needs your intention. And then resolve yourself to committing that work, to setting that intention and to fulfilling it. Draw the hands together in front of the heart. We'll begin our session with an Om. Take a nice breath in. Om. Bow the head to the heart, acknowledging all that is. Lift the face, release the hands. And so today we come together to talk about Svadyaya. Such a great word. Sanskrit word, Svadyaya. It always reminds me of the Yaya sisterhood. Svadyaya, self-study. The study of the self. And this is the 9th virtue of 10. So we've come through non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, economy of energy, non-grasping, contentment, cleanliness, and discipline. And now we get to self-study. And some people might say that, well, you have to have all these other ones kind of in some kind of practice before you can actually get into the crux of self-study. And other people would say all of those things, all the other 8 that come before it, are aspects of self-study. That we pay attention to our life and the areas where it's violent and where it's not violent. And we understand the relationship between violence, non-violence, and how we perceive ourselves in the world. And the same thing for the other 7. That we're actually practicing a form of self-study when we are paying attention to the presence or absence of those virtues in our life as we commit to them. Not that somebody else isn't doing it. In the spiritual realm of things, it doesn't really matter what other people are doing. It matters what we ourselves are doing. I can't look at Cindy and say, well, you're not practicing ahimsa right now. Therefore, I can't practice ahimsa. That makes no sense. She has her path to walk. I have my path to walk. We each have our path to walk. And the practice of self-study allows us to see our path for exactly how we are walking it. And then to make the appropriate changes. So the self-study, the Svadyaya, the first level of this is paying attention. Some people will automatically go to the kind of the pinnacle of self-study, which is to see yourself as a reflection of the divine energy that moves through you and to be that. So to study yourself in that way, to study yourself as divine energy, to study yourself as, I don't want to say as God, but as an extension of God. But if we go there first, then we haven't really acknowledged the obstacles to that. So we really do most often need to start with our physical life, with our physical mental behavior, with the things that are moving us through our day-to-day experiences that are either keeping us away from the inquiry into divinity or sending us closer to it. We need to understand what role we play in this. And the only way we can understand that is if we commit ourselves to the inquiry. So we say, in what ways am I violent? If I'm violent, then that comes along with a lot of other things. The violence is married to guilt. The violence is married to animosity. The violence is married to vengeance. The violence is married to so many different things. And the violence is chaos in and of itself, which is out of control if you allow it to be. So then we can look at so many other parts of our life and recognize that violence has its tentacles into everything. If we lead a violent life in even one realm, let's say that there's one person that you really despise. Your despising of that one person colors every other relationship in your life. Because when we despise something, we can't let go of it. It's like a poison that just continually takes over. And we want to talk about it. And we want to gossip about it. And we want to make up stories of, whatever about it. And so it reaches in and it touches every other relationship that we have. Because if we're busy making up stories in our own mind about how much we despise a person and how much we're going to prove that we despise that person, then we're not present with anything else, period. We're not. We can be hugging our child while we say this. We can be hugging our lover while we're saying this to ourselves. But if we're saying it to ourselves, then the hug, the love is only going through the motions. It's not having the opportunity to really be the experience that you're having in the moment because the tentacles of violence have poisoned it. So we need to look at our life and the areas where there's violence, the areas where there is discontent, the areas where there's thievery, the areas where there is a waste of our energy. Have you ever had a day where you've just expended all your energy and then come home and snapped at your loved one? Right. And the more we waste our energy, the more we snap. And snapping is not nonviolent. Snapping is violent. So when we waste our energy, we are actually committing a violence to ourselves, which is going to have tentacles that reach out into every other relationship. The most direct relationships we have are with each other because we all kind of coexist in this physical realm. But those tentacles reach into our divine relationship as well, our relationship with Source. If we think that there's some kind of benefit to be had by harming someone, hating someone, having a despising attitude towards someone, then that is going to take precedent over our relationship with Source, over our relationship with the sacred. It just will. And then we'll just say, maybe next Sunday I'll go to church. Maybe next Sunday I'll go to the ashram. Maybe next week. Because we'll be so consumed that eventually nothing else will matter, even if we say it does. We say it does because we know on some level of our conscious being, we know that there is a far more healthy place to be for us mentally and emotionally. There is also a longing in the heart that calls us to a greater unity, to release feelings that are, loaded with animosity. And so those callings, they say, start thinking differently, start looking at things differently, start behaving differently. But the ego has such a grip. So there's a confusion that happens. And the confusion is, well, I am being a nice person. After all, I'm not saying it to them. And we start making confusing statements to ourselves, which brings us into a level of ignorance that is very difficult to get out of. It's like quicksand. So we have to be very clear about how we expend our energy, about how we speak, about how we walk through this world, about the intention we carry toward ourselves and toward others, and recognize that the way that we interact with the world, the beliefs that we have about the world and all the other beings in it, directly impact our ability to know the divine, to know whatever aspect of God it is that we have looked to. This is in large part why the world is suffering today. For all of its flaws, religion also has a lot of benefits. It has the benefit of service, the benefit of education. There is a benefit there, the benefit of unity and community. There's definitely a lot of benefit there. But for all the benefit, there's also the pitfall. And the pitfall is when you think that your animosity is more important than God. Or you think your animosity is proof of your love of God. And let me just ask you, has hate ever proven love in any way, shape, or form? No. That's completely ridiculous. You cannot use hate as evidence that you love something. It doesn't work. It never works. The only thing that proves love is love. The only thing that proves unity is unity. The only thing that proves compassion is compassion. And in order to bolster those qualities within ourselves, we have to be willing to look at the others and the way that we bring those forward. And so that's kind of maybe the first level of inquiry and self-study, is how am I living my life? What is my relationship to these virtues? Do I just kind of shut my eyes to them? Do I try to practice them? Do I stumble and fall and then just allow myself to get back up and keep going? I mean, what's the deal? How do I walk through the world? And part of that walking through the world is this physical body too. So part of our self-study has to do with understanding this physical body. It's like, I say me and I automatically think this body. But in yoga and Vedanta and all of the related traditions, this body is not me. This body is my vehicle. It houses my soul, my spirit, whatever word you want to use there. It houses me, but it is not me. This body is constantly biologically changing. It's born and someday it will die. But my soul is eternal. My soul continues on and on and on. So this body can't be the definition of me. But yet I walk through this world as if it is. We all do. We all walk through this world as if this body is the be-all, end-all. So much so that we commit thousands of dollars a year, sometimes tens of thousands, and as a greater community of the West, billions of dollars to get this body where we want it to be. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But there can be something really harmful about it. Especially if that is our primary focus, that I want the body. Therefore, I don't have time for the rest. I don't have time to know Source. I don't have time for God. I don't have time for service. I don't have time for compassion. I got to work it. Get to that. But if we're always busy getting somewhere, then when do we ever know we've arrived? We don't. So we have to come into right relationship with this body. So that's another level of this self-study. And it's part of how we walk through the world. Do we walk through the world with compassion and respect for this body? Acknowledging the work that it does for us? Your body will do everything you ask it to. It will have a baby. If you're a female, it will have a baby. Right? And if you're male, it will help to produce that baby. I mean, think about that. It will run marathons. It will climb mountains. It will swim oceans and seas. It will do whatever you ask it to the best of its ability. For sure, you said thank you to the judges at the marathon and the coordinators. For sure, you said thank you to the lifeguards and to whoever inspired you to become a swimmer. For sure, you said thank you to the doctors and even to the baby. When did you say thank you to your body? When did you say thank you? Thank you for running, for swimming, for climbing, for hiking, for bringing forth life. Thank you. When did you treat your body with respect and dignity? Because it has shown up for you in every possible way that it could. That's part of self-study too, is to know that most of the time we don't say thank you. We just say more. Give me more. And when we behave like that toward this body, then that is the pattern of behavior we're putting in place toward everything else. And we'll begin to look at all aspects of the world and all aspects of divinity as give me more, do more, show me more, prove more, prove more. Prove it to me again. Prove it to me again. And if that's what we're looking for, if that's where our mind is constantly laid up at prove it to me again, prove it to me again, prove it to me again, then when do we ever arrive? We miss the arrival. We miss the point. Then the next level of spiritual inquiry or of self-study is knowing our mind, knowing our emotions, knowing when our mind and emotions are out of control, when they're in control, and knowing the relationship between out-of-control emotions and the violation of virtues. Every single one of us has virtues within us. We're all virtuous people. Every one of us is virtuous. The question is, do we practice the virtues? Do we practice them? And if the emotions are chaotic and we're bouncing back and forth like a super ball between hate and anger and, jealousy and envy, then we don't have space for the virtues to be practiced because we're caught up in this other storyline. A storyline that inevitably comes back to violating the first virtue, nonviolence. So we need to look at that and we need to study our emotions and understand to some degree where they're coming from, what they're based in. And that's a really complicated work. The first one, coming to know the body and our reactions and responses to the body, is certainly complicated. The mind is exquisitely complicated. First of all, because it's subtle and it's based in the past, the present, and it projects into the future. And so we're never quite sure where it's residing in a given moment. Is this because of the past? Is this because of where I am now? Or is this fear for the future? Or some combination of all these things? So we really have to sit with the mind and not only come to understand the mental emotional triggers and how they impact everything else in our life, but also understand the space within the mind and emotions that we're not occupying, that we're not actively putting ourselves into. The mind is a gift. So many people say the mind is a curse, shut it down. No, the mind, when it misbehaves, is a pain. It's a suffering. But it's not a curse. It's part of the gift of this life. If we can learn how to utilize the mind, how to train it even, if we want to use that word, how to allow its resilience and its beauty to come forward, then we will know how to sit in the space of the mind and allow it to be prayerful, dignified, purposeful, in line with our Dharma. Otherwise, we're just kind of chasing stuff, shiny objects. But it gets complicated. It's complicated because of past, present, and future. It's complicated because we make it that way. We like our complications, don't we? We do. Everybody likes a good puzzle. But we've gotten ourselves so deep into this puzzle that we've also talked ourselves into believing it's missing a few pieces, right? This puzzle doesn't have all the pieces. I guess I'm just going to suffer forever. And I'll just have to settle for this. And the reality is you're not missing any pieces. You're just looking over here, and the piece is over here. So you got to bring yourself back to center so that you can see the bigger picture and recognize the wholeness of that picture. Don't know who said it. Maybe it was, could have been the Pope. I'm not sure. I'm sure it was said by many. God would never create something that was broken. Why? Because divinity is perfect. And perfect doesn't create imperfection. It brings forth perfection. It brings forth a mirror of itself. So when you look in the mirror and say to yourself, I'm just so broken. Yes, you may feel broken in this life. But that feeling is not who you are. And it's only a moment in time. It's not the big picture. It's like looking at a Picasso and seeing only that yellow speck. That yellow speck right there. That yellow speck is not perfect. But if you back up and you look at the entirety of the picture, right? Who was it, Monet, who did stars? Is that Monet? Oh my gosh. When you look at the whole of the picture, it's gorgeous. But if you go up and just look at a blob, little tiny dot paint, you're like, what purpose does that have? So part of this understanding that we are whole in and of ourselves requires that we step back and we stop looking at just the little discontentments, that we learn how to breathe through those, be with them when they're there, but that we remember there's a bigger picture to be had. And then to constantly step back so that we can see the bigger picture more and more fully. And then emotions, we have to learn how to work with our emotions, and that requires we get in touch with our inner child. Such a cliche statement, the inner child. But it's true. It's absolutely true. Each and every one of us has an inner child that wasn't hugged enough, wasn't told they were loved enough, was kicked on the playground or something along those lines. Every one of us does. And so it's important that we look at the trajectory of life and where the harm or the injuries, the trauma was inflicted, and that we give ourselves permission, active permission, to accept the trauma, to accept it, to embrace it, to hug it, to throw your arms around it, to integrate it into your whole being. See, when you work with your trauma, you don't just sweep it under the rug. What you're actually doing is picking the rug out and sweeping it back out again and saying, okay, look at all I've collected. Oh, goodness, this has made such a freaking mess. Somebody get the broom. No, you don't sweep it back under the rug. You leave it out in clear daylight where you can see it and be constantly reminded of it. This is the trauma. Okay, great. Now what do I do? Well, you work with somebody who's a specialist in the area that you need specialization in, right? You work with somebody, you talk with somebody. Yes, of course, you're going to talk with your friends and your family, but just know that they're not therapists. And so, unless they are. And so they can only give you their opinion about things, where a therapist or a spiritual counselor can support you, guide you through step by step, ways that you can see the purpose of your past, the harm as well as the benefit of it, and how you might integrate it more deeply into your present day so that you can know your wholeness more clearly. This is all self-study. And it goes on and on and on. So self-study is very, very important, extremely important. Nothing else makes sense without it. Why would we practice nonviolence? Why would we practice truthfulness? Why would we practice non-stealing? Why would we practice economy of energy? What does it matter? If we're not interested in knowing ourselves and understanding ourselves on all levels, what purpose does all that have? It doesn't. And part of that is because up to now, we're talking in some part about getting to know who you think you are. Who am I based on my trauma? Who am I based on the world I live in? Who am I based on the defining factors, male, female, this, that, young, old? Who am I in the world? But then, spiritually speaking, we bring ourselves back to remembering, actually none of that is who I am. Those are all roles I play that influence my ability to see the innermost self. The innermost self, which is not a self of suffering. The innermost self, which is not a self that has been traumatized. The trauma stops us from seeing the innermost self, stops us from communing with it. It's like that's, the detour on the road to knowing yourself. So we have to go, we have to work with it. We need to integrate it, we need to accept it, work to understand it, integrate it, and then move beyond it. But not beyond it as if it never happened. Beyond it in a way that says, I understand that this is not who I am. So that we can move into a deeper relationship with the spirit. And that's pretty much the ultimate self-study, is to come to know your spiritual self and to come to know that your spiritual self is part of that divine energy, that divine consciousness that permeates all things everywhere. Many traditions are what we call dualistic, meaning that God is here and you are here too. But there are also traditions that are non-dualistic, where God is here and so are you. And you are an extension of God. You're like, you're like one of God's cells, right? Would you say that the cell that creates the skin of your leg is not part of your body? No, you would say that's part of my body. Well, you're like one of God's cells. You're part of God. You're not separate from God. You're like a wave that comes out of the ocean. Do you say, well, the wave no longer belongs to the ocean because it decided to become a wave? No, of course not. The wave always goes back to the ocean, some way or another. It makes its way back. It's always part of the ocean, just like you're always part of God. And by God, I don't mean male or female here. I'm just using that as the placeholder. Whatever name you want to put there is fine. But you are part of that. And it's through self-study that we come to know and understand that on a much, much deeper level than just logical. or just emotional. Certainly logical and emotional is important because we're embodied beings. And there's nothing more beautiful than being able to feel that connection, than being able to surrender ourselves to that connection. However, at some point in time, we want to grow beyond the need for emotional reliance and into the truth itself. The truth itself does not necessitate emotions. It simply is. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is all self-study. And the more that we commit ourselves to self-study of who we think we are, of what we've collected along the way, of how we walk through the world, the more we are preparing ourselves to make the ultimate offering. Sounds kind of, what's the word? Ominous, doesn't it? The ultimate offering. The ultimate offering is your heart. That's the ultimate offering. It's like you say, Durga Ma, I'm here to be in service of you, of this divine consciousness that is part of everything that I've chosen to call Durga, but can go by any name it wants to, you know. Who am I to tell God, stand in that corner over there and be only something, only one thing, that's it, you know? No. If God is perfect, then God can be whatever God wants to be. God can show up as an ant. And as a matter of fact, there's a story. There was a king who thought he was very much devoted to God. He was like, I am the most devoted to Shiva. I would know Shiva anywhere. Shiva could show up as anything, a tree, a sun, a bug. I would know Shiva, and I would bow down. And Shiva heard this, and he thought, that's interesting, isn't it? So there was this big parade on this day. I believe Shivaratri will say. And the king was there. And, you know, typically when royalty comes to a parade, you know, they have their spot, right? And nobody else is allowed to go there. Well, this beggar showed up and made his way, kind of snuck past the guards and stood there, you know, right next to the king. And the king didn't notice him at first because he was beneath him, you know. But then when he turned to look and see what was coming next on the parade, he saw this very dirty, you know, beaten up beggar. And he said, what are you doing here? You are not permitted to be here. This is the sanctum of the king. Get your dirty self out of here. And the beggar looked at him and he said, oh, my lord, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize this was your space and your space only. Are you sure I should leave? Because I didn't mean to insult you. And the king said, be gone with you. Who do you think you are? This is an insult. This is an insult to Shiva. And the beggar said, oh, my lord, I would never intend to insult Shiva. I will leave now. And with that, he met the king's eyes. And the king realized, and he fell down onto his knees and he cried. And he said, I am so sorry. My ego gripped me in that moment, and I failed to see you. Forgive me. How many moments do we fail to see the divine? Many. Self-study empowers us to see the divine more often, in more moments, and to realign ourselves in moments where we are absolutely resistant to seeing the divine. That we say, oh, wait, ego has taken over again, so let me turn myself back around. Let me come back to this and back to a humble nature where I can begin to recognize the goodness and the beauty. And it's really important, too, to acknowledge that we talk a lot about recognizing the goodness and the beauty, but that doesn't mean that we ignore what isn't wonderful. It doesn't mean that we ignore pain and suffering. We don't. As a matter of fact, when we acknowledge more profoundly the things in this world that are good and beautiful, and the things in the cosmic realm that are good and beautiful, which is, of course, everything, then it gives us this exquisite ability to show up for suffering, to show up for it, to be present to it, to not be recoiled by it, to not be grossed out and judgmental over it, to not let our preferences drive us away from it. We come into understanding that suffering is part of nature and it is going to happen to every single one of us. So just like we integrate our trauma from the past, we learn how to integrate our suffering in the present. And we learn methods and ways and mental ways, emotional ways and spiritual ways to avoid unnecessary suffering in the future. Because there's a difference between necessary and unnecessary suffering. We can't escape necessary suffering. It's not possible. But we certainly don't need to suffer unnecessarily. And self-study supports that. It says, see the world more clearly and you will suffer less. See the world more clearly. Be more clear in your relationships and suffering will be less. Be more clear about the impact that you have on others through your behaviors and you will suffer less. Be clear about your intention and then live to fulfill that intention and you will suffer less. Because if we live a life of violence or any of the associated evils, as they call them, if we live a life based in that, then we're also living a life based in regret, resentment, guilt, and a lot of really soul-sucking vampire energies, the kind that steal your aliveness and your radiance from you, or at least we think they do. We give it away to them. We say, I've got to feel this guilt. I've got to feel this. I've got to be there with that. And the reality is, no, you don't. You need to change whatever behavior led to feeling guilty so that you don't feel it anymore. Not because you're brushing it under the rug, but because you've taken all the crap out from under the rug that you've brushed under there for however many years you've been alive, and now you're inspecting it, looking at it, and saying, well, that didn't work out the way that I had thought, so let me change that behavior so I don't have to have those same repercussions, those same consequences any longer. Does that make sense? So then ultimately, as we move through all of this, all these different phases and stages, and as you can tell, this is not an overnight thing, right? Yeah, it's not like, when you go to work and your boss says, that's it, you get a raise. You went from being a general worker to being a manager overnight. That's not like that. No, it's like hundreds of thousands of lifetimes. A little bit here, a little bit there. But we can set the intention to do a lot in this life. Whatever linear time we have in this life, we can have that intention to commit ourselves to living as holistically as possible. And in doing so, we open up the space within ourselves for a fuller life, a life that is more genuinely based in love and faith and joy and unity. And we open up ourselves to a more profound relationship with divinity. That's the key. That's where it leads to. It leads to us returning to that which we came. But being alive while we're at it. Can you imagine walking through the world as a completely liberated soul? Like, what might that be like? To be free. And it's not free as in, well, now I get to do whatever the hell I want. That's not free. That's bondage. Because when I want to do something, I'm saying no to everything else. So that's bondage to one thing only. Freedom is not bondage. Freedom means I will accept whatever comes to me and I will give all I have fearlessly and without attachment. I will accept whatever comes, and I will give whatever I have fearlessly. And that's what this mudra means. These two mudras, Varda mudra and Abhaya mudra. To give and to receive fearlessly. Questions or reflections? That's a lot, huh? Yes.
I thought it was very nice to hear about like wanting to cater to your inner child a little bit, because I feel like ever since I had my daughter, I feel like I give so much to her that sometimes I'm like, I wish someone would like care for me like that. So like that just really connected with me, and I enjoyed hearing that. But and it also was brought up in another woman's circle that I went to at a yoni steam session. So I thought it was very nice to hear, because it's good to be able to care for your inner child, because when she was first born, I was like, I'm caring for her so much that it was hard for me to even like focus on myself. So I had, and I'm still developing that now. She's only 4 months old, so it definitely takes some time. But I'm getting back into the swing of, okay, I can care. There's a me outside of like motherhood in a way. And I just have to like care for that a little more than like my mother's side, and care for like, because I have to care for my mother's side as well, so I can care for her. But I also have to like have a distinguish between both of them, so I can still care for myself just as well.
Absolutely. And one of the things that happens to a lot of women when they have a baby is that they become the mother role only.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the only role. You're a teacher. You're a provider. You're a human being. You're so many different roles. And the teacher role is perhaps right now second only to motherhood. Because in the mothering, you are also the teacher. And so you can always ask yourself, and whenever you feel guilty, and almost every woman I have ever spoken to, when they take self-time and they have little ones, they feel guilty. So when you feel guilty, you can say to yourself, maybe I will feel a little guilty, but by doing this, I am teaching her how to take care of herself. And then maybe she won't have to feel that guilt. And wouldn't that be beautiful?
Yeah.
We always want for our children to end up better than we were, right? So teach her how to take good care of herself by you taking good care of yourself. Yeah. Absolutely. Questions or reflections for anybody else? Yes?
I always find for me, sometimes I struggle with self-study and like intellectualizing.
Mm-hmm.
Like it can easily go into like that. So I observe that too. And it's always just so interesting like how the mind can be like so tricky sometimes to like justify and rationalize, and like, so that's like an interesting observation as well. How self-study can open the door to the intellect to really awaken for myself anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that we can do, and I happen to be a very intellectual person, and I'm also a very creative person. Neither side of my brain really turns off, which is a blessing and interesting. But when the intellectual side comes up, it's like plus like increases like. Opposites decrease. So if I feel that the intellectual is rising up too much, then I'm going to invite in a little bit of the emotion. But I'm going to have it correspond with something. It's not just going to be chaotic emotion. It's going to be, now is time for chanting. Now is time for scriptural study. Now is time for meditation. I'm going to allow the intellect to be there, but I'm going to soften it with appropriate emotion. And this is the cultivation of bhakti. Bhakti is the love, right? Yeah, and saying that I'm not just an intellectual being, and I'm also not just an emotional being. I'm actually a devotional being. So let me use whatever tools and experiences I have to that end. But yeah, the intellect is tricky. Very, very tricky, because it's like, I got that down. I understand that. Yeah, and then, you stub your toe and it's all gone, right? And then it's like, oh, or it systematizes everything. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's like, well, that didn't work, so that doesn't work. Okay, go over here. And it's like, no. Just because it didn't work out the way the intellect said it should doesn't mean that it doesn't have efficacy, right? Maybe you need to learn a different way right now. And so reminding yourself constantly, the intellect is the discerner, but it's not 100%. Right? The intellect can actually be extremely faulty, very faulty. That's why science has hypotheses, right? Theories, abundant theories. But how many truths has science discovered? And what science says is we don't play in the game of truth. Not really. Because we play in the game of continuous, what is the word for it? Continual outcome. If something happens over and over again after an experiment, same result, then it has a continuity to it, but that doesn't mean that next time it's going to hold fast. Maybe next time it falls apart. When I lived in Toms River years and years ago in New Jersey, what is gravity? Gravity is what? Downward flow of energy, right? And that's kind of what keeps our feet on the ground, gravity. Well, everybody thought gravity was it. Like there's only gravity, and that's why everything stays on the earth. And then somebody came up and said, actually, there's this thing called anti-gravity. Like, what? Not here, out in space maybe, right? But not here. It's like, no, here. There's actually anti-gravity here. There's reverse gravity. And when I was living in Toms River, this is the way that they explained the roof of JCPenney just lifting off of the top of the building when there was no breeze, no storm, a perfectly blue sky on a sunny day in the middle of the summer. The roof went whoom, and then crashed back down again. Luckily, nobody was injured. But people were like, oh, it had to have been like, a little twister or something. Nobody saw it. It's like, no, it was anti-gravity. Because gravity works till it doesn't, right? We have to allow that in our life and say, this is going to work to some degree. It's going to teach me until I need to learn something else. And then this won't be the method. The intellect can grab onto that if you let it. Yeah. Oh, it's so fun though. It's so fun. Any other questions or reflections? The self-study, one of the more important parts of this is relationship, right? It's like understanding our relationship to ourselves. That's what it's for. But the mirror of that relationship is also found in our relationship with others. So whenever you treat another person poorly, know that you are a reflection of how you treat yourself. And whenever you treat another person well, that is a reflection of how you would like to treat yourself. And so turn yourself inward, treat yourself kindly, and don't treat yourself violently. That right there will open each of us up to so much understanding. Yeah. All right, let's sit tall and close the eyes. Place the right hand on the heart and left hand over the right. And connect with the breath, the in-breath and the out-breath. And feel that this body is breathing. My body is breathing. And I am witnessing that breath. I am watching it happen. I'm feeling it, sensing it. But this body and that breath are not who I really am. They are merely an experience that I'm having. What lies beyond the body and the breath? Where do they come from? What lies beyond these thoughts? Where do they come from? Inevitably, we will find ourselves in the midst of a flow of divine consciousness. And when we come to being saturated by that consciousness, knowingly, then we will have our answer. We will have rediscovered ourself and the self in all. We'll lift our voices in one Om. Take a breath in. Om. Namaste. Thank you all for being here today. So good to gather with each and every one of you. Have a lovely afternoon. I hope you're staying for lunch. Lunch is being served